The disorder consuming our political life is not new. 24 centuries ago, Plato witnessed the collapse of Athens and diagnosed the spiritual sickness that destroys civilizations from within. The same disease that killed classical democracy now ravages our own republic. What appears as mere political dysfunction is actually the manifestation of a deeper crisis, the loss of philosophical wisdom about the human soul and its proper order. Modern man, convinced of his sophistication, has forgotten what Plato knew with crystalline clarity, that political order depends entirely upon the order of consciousness, and that societies become tyrannical when they abandon the search for transcendent truth. The chaos of our time would not surprise Plato. He saw it coming through his penetrating analysis of how democratic societies inevitably decay when they lose contact with eternal principles. His Republic reads like a prophecy of our current predicament, revealing why our constitutional forms cannot preserve liberty when the spiritual substance has been hollowed out. The shadows dancing on our cave walls are more sophisticated than those Plato described, but they serve the same function, keeping citizens content with illusions while reality crumbles around them. Chapter 1: The Eternal Return of the Cave. Plato's allegory of the cave is not merely an ancient teaching device, it is a precise diagnosis of our contemporary predicament. In every generation, human beings mistake shadows on the wall for reality itself, preferring comfortable illusions to the painful ascent toward truth. What Plato understood, and what we have forgotten, is that political communities naturally tend toward the cave-like existence of shared delusions. Our modern media creates exactly the shadowplay Plato described. Citizens sit chained before screens, watching flickering images that politicians and ideologues project, mistaking these representations for reality. The philosopher who attempts to lead people toward authentic understanding faces the same hostility Plato predicted. The cave dwellers prefer their familiar darkness to the painful brightness of truth. But Plato's insight goes deeper than a simple analogy about media manipulation. He recognized that the transition from philosophical inquiry to ideological certainty marks the beginning of political decay. When a society stops questioning its fundamental assumptions, when it becomes convinced it has found final answers to eternal questions, it begins the descent into tyranny. The ideological movements of our time exhibit precisely this Gnostic confidence, the certainty that human reason has penetrated ultimate mysteries and can construct perfect social arrangements. The cave allegory reveals why democratic societies become vulnerable to demagogues. The masses, having lost connection to transcendent truth, become susceptible to anyone who promises to explain everything through simple formulas. The philosopher's patient ascent toward reality cannot compete with the ideologue's immediate satisfaction of providing complete explanations for complex realities. Consider how thoroughly our educational system has become a cave manufacturing operation. Students are taught to analyze texts for hidden power structures rather than to seek truth about reality. They learn to deconstruct traditional wisdom rather than to participate in the philosophical quest that created it. The result is graduates who mistake sophistical cleverness for wisdom, who confuse the ability to critique with the capacity to understand. Plato saw that true political order requires citizens capable of distinguishing between appearance and reality, between opinion and knowledge. Our crisis stems from the systematic destruction of this capacity for philosophical discrimination. When everyone's opinion counts equally, when no transcendent standard exists by which to judge competing claims, political discourse degenerates into mere power struggle between organized interests. The return from the cave requires recognizing that our current condition is precisely the one Plato described, a society of prisoners who mistake shadows for reality and resist anyone who suggests that truth lies beyond their immediate perceptions. The first step toward political sanity is acknowledging our entrapment. Chapter 1: The Eternal Return of the Cave. Plato's allegory of the cave is not merely an ancient teaching device, it is a precise diagnosis of our contemporary predicament. In every generation, Human beings mistake shadows on the wall for reality itself, preferring comfortable illusions to the painful ascent toward truth. What Plato understood, and what we have forgotten, is that political communities naturally tend toward the cave-like existence of shared delusions. Our modern media creates exactly the shadowplay Plato described. Citizens sit chained before screens, watching flickering images that politicians and ideologues project, mistaking these representations for reality. The philosopher who attempts to lead people toward authentic understanding faces the same hostility Plato predicted. The cave dwellers prefer their familiar darkness to the painful brightness of truth. But Plato's insight goes deeper than a simple analogy about media manipulation. He recognized that the transition from philosophical inquiry to ideological certainty marks the beginning of political decay. When a society stops questioning its fundamental assumptions, when it becomes convinced it has found final answers to eternal questions, it begins the descent into tyranny. The ideological movements of our time exhibit precisely this Gnostic confidence, the certainty that human reason has penetrated ultimate mysteries and can construct perfect social arrangements. The cave allegory reveals why democratic societies become vulnerable to demagogues. The masses, having lost connection to transcendent truth, become susceptible to anyone who promises to explain everything through simple formulas. The philosopher's patient ascent toward reality cannot compete with the ideologue's immediate satisfaction of providing complete explanations for complex realities. Consider how thoroughly our educational system has become a cave manufacturing operation. Students are taught to analyze texts for hidden power structures rather than to seek truth about reality. They learn to deconstruct traditional wisdom rather than to participate in the philosophical quest that created it. The result is graduates who mistake sophistical cleverness for wisdom, who confuse the ability to critique with the capacity to understand. The cave dwellers of our time are not merely ignorant, they are systematically miseducated. They have been trained to regard the search for transcendent truth as naive, to treat all claims about reality as mere constructions of power, to reduce philosophical questions to sociological problems. This produces a peculiar form of darkness, not the simple ignorance of those who have never seen light, but the complex delusion of those who have been convinced that darkness is light. Plato understood that the cave represents not just individual ignorance but collective self-deception. Societies create elaborate systems of shared illusions that protect citizens from confronting uncomfortable truths about themselves and their condition. Our therapeutic culture serves precisely this function, offering endless techniques for feeling better about ourselves without requiring actual moral or spiritual development. The shadows on our cave walls include the illusion that material progress constitutes genuine human advance, that democratic procedures guarantee just outcomes, that individual liberation leads to social harmony, that technical solutions exist for spiritual problems. These beliefs persist not because they correspond to reality but because they provide comfort in a world that would otherwise demand genuine transformation. Plato saw that true political order requires citizens capable of distinguishing between appearance and reality, between opinion and knowledge. Our crisis stems from the systematic destruction of this capacity for philosophical discrimination. When everyone's opinion counts equally, when no transcendent standard exists by which to judge competing claims, political discourse degenerates into mere power struggle between organized interests. The return from the cave requires recognizing that our current condition is precisely the one Plato described, a society of prisoners who mistake shadows for reality and resist anyone who suggests that truth lies beyond their immediate perceptions. The first step toward political sanity is acknowledging our entrapment in illusions we have mistaken for sophisticated understanding. Chapter 2: The Philosopher-King and the Death of Wisdom. Plato's concept of the philosopher-king has been misunderstood as a proposal for intellectuals to rule. The truth is far more profound and disturbing for our time. Plato argued that only those who have oriented their souls toward transcendent truth can exercise legitimate authority. The philosopher-king represents not a technocratic solution, but the recognition that political power requires spiritual qualification. Our modern democratic theory rejects this insight entirely. We have embraced the notion that political authority derives from popular consent rather than spiritual order. The result is what Plato predicted, the rule of appetites rather than reason, the triumph of clever rhetoric over wisdom, the reduction of statecraft to the manipulation of public opinion. Consider how thoroughly we have inverted Plato's vision. Our political leaders are selected not for their philosophical depth or spiritual development, but for their ability to appeal to the lowest common denominator of public sentiment. We reward those who promise to satisfy material desires rather than those who call citizens to higher aspirations. The very suggestion that political authority might require moral or spiritual qualification strikes modern ears as anti-democratic. But Plato understood what we refuse to acknowledge, that democratic equality, divorced from the order of being, becomes democratic chaos. When all opinions are considered equally valid, when no transcendent standard exists by which to judge competing claims, political life degenerates into mere power struggle between organized interests. The death of the philosopher-king ideal has produced not freedom, but its opposite, the tyranny of those skilled in mass manipulation. Our elections have become contests between competing demagogues, each promising to deliver material satisfaction without demanding spiritual growth. Plato knew that such politics must end in the collapse of constitutional order. What strikes me most forcefully is how our political class exemplifies the very opposite of philosophical wisdom. They mistake cleverness for intelligence, popularity for authority, the ability to manipulate opinion for genuine leadership. They are skilled in the techniques of persuasion but ignorant of the realities they purport to govern. They can win elections but cannot create order. The philosopher-king was never intended as a practical political program but as a standard by which to measure the spiritual health of political authority. When rulers lack philosophical formation, when they are guided by appetite rather than reason, when they mistake their own interests for the common good, the community inevitably experiences the disorder that flows from disordered leadership. Our founding fathers understood this principle implicitly. They designed institutions intended to filter leadership through processes that would favor wisdom over mere popularity. But institutions cannot preserve what the culture no longer values. When society systematically undermines the formation of philosophical character, it inevitably produces leaders who reflect its own spiritual confusion. The tragedy of our current situation is not that we lack competent administrators, though we often do, but that we have lost the concept of wisdom that would make genuine statesmanship possible. We have reduced politics to management, statesmanship to electoral success, leadership to the satisfaction of interest groups. The result is government by those least qualified to govern. Plato's insight remains valid. Political authority requires spiritual qualification. Not the external qualification of degrees or credentials, but the internal qualification of souls oriented toward truth rather than appearance, toward justice rather than advantage, toward the common good rather than private interest. The recovery of legitimate authority requires recovering Plato's insight that the right to rule must be grounded in the ruler's participation in transcendent truth rather than merely popular approval. Until we acknowledge this fundamental requirement, we will continue to experience the political chaos that inevitably follows when appetite rules reason, when sophistical cleverness masquerades as wisdom, when the pursuit of power replaces the search for truth as the animating principle of political life. Chapter 3: The Soul-City Analogy and Modern Fragmentation. Plato's Republic reveals its deepest wisdom through the analogy between soul and city. Just as individual psyche requires the proper ordering of reason, spirit, and appetite, so political community requires the harmonious arrangement of its constituent parts under the guidance of wisdom. This insight illuminates our contemporary crisis with startling clarity. Modern political theory has abandoned this understanding entirely. We conceive politics as mere aggregation of individual preferences rather than the ordering of community life according to transcendent principles. The result is the fragmentation Plato predicted, societies divided against themselves because they reflect the disorder of unintegrated souls. Consider how our political discourse mirrors the chaos of disordered consciousness. Just as the unphilosophical soul is torn between competing desires, our public life is characterized by irreconcilable conflicts between groups that share no common vision of human excellence. Each faction pursues its particular interests without reference to the good of the whole, producing the very injustice Plato defined as the dominance of parts over the ordering principle. The therapeutic insight of Plato's psychology applies equally to political pathology. Individual healing requires recognizing the proper hierarchy within consciousness, reason guiding spirit in the government of appetite. Similarly, social healing requires acknowledging transcendent sources of order that can adjudicate between competing claims and orient community life toward genuine rather than apparent goods. Our therapeutic culture promises individual fulfillment through the satisfaction of desires rather than their proper ordering. This same logic has infected our politics, creating the consumerist democracy Plato foresaw, a system dedicated to maximizing individual satisfaction rather than promoting human excellence. The result is neither individual happiness nor social harmony, but the multiplication of conflicts between insatiable appetites. What strikes me most forcefully is how precisely our condition fulfills Plato's analysis of democratic decay. Having rejected the philosophical understanding of soul order, we inevitably experience the political disorder that follows from spiritual chaos. Our communities fragment because our souls are fragmented. Our politics become irrational because our consciousness has lost contact with rational principles. The Soul City analogy reveals why constitutional engineering cannot solve our fundamental problems. Laws and institutions can preserve order only when they reflect and support the proper ordering of consciousness. When citizens lack internal integration, when they cannot distinguish between rational and irrational desires, when they mistake immediate satisfaction for genuine good, no external arrangement can create social harmony. Plato understood that the just soul and the just city are not separate problems but aspects of a single reality. The person who has achieved internal integration through philosophical discipline naturally contributes to social integration. Conversely, the person driven by unordered appetites inevitably contributes to social fragmentation, regardless of good intentions or constitutional protections. This insight explains why our political reforms consistently fail to produce the promised improvements. We attempt to create order through external arrangements while systematically undermining the internal conditions that make order possible. We promote democracy while destroying the philosophical formation that democratic citizenship requires. We celebrate diversity while eliminating the unifying principles that make diverse communities coherent. The recovery of political order requires recovering the understanding that human communities are not mechanical aggregations of separate individuals but organic wholes that reflect the spiritual condition of their members. Until we address the disorder in consciousness that produces disorder in society, our political problems will remain intractable. Plato's message is both humbling and hopeful. Humbling because it reveals that our external political problems reflect internal spiritual problems that cannot be solved through mere institutional reform. Hopeful because it shows that genuine political transformation remains possible through the patient work of consciousness formation that begins with individual souls and extends gradually to community life. The just city becomes possible when enough citizens achieve the just soul through philosophical discipline and spiritual development. Chapter 4: The Cycle of Constitutions and Our Democratic Decay. Plato's analysis of constitutional decay in the Republic reads like a prophecy of our current predicament. He traced the inevitable decline from aristocracy through timocracy and oligarchy to democracy and finally tyranny. Each stage represents a further departure from the philosophical ordering principle, a deeper surrender to the appetitive elements in human nature. Our founding fathers understood this cycle and attempted to create a mixed constitution that could resist democratic decay. But they could not solve the fundamental problem Plato identified, that constitutional forms, however ingeniously designed, cannot preserve order when the spiritual foundation has eroded. Laws and institutions reflect the character of the people who operate them. The democratic stage of decay, as Plato described it, manifests in the celebration of equality over excellence, the confusion of freedom with license, the reduction of education to opinion sharing rather than the formation of souls capable of recognizing truth. Does this not perfectly describe our cultural moment? We have created a society that systematically undermines the conditions necessary for its own preservation. Plato saw that democratic equality, when divorced from the recognition of transcendent hierarchy, produces not justice but chaos. Every distinction between higher and lower, better and worse, becomes suspect. The teacher must pretend equality with the student, the parent with the child, the wise with the foolish. The result is the dissolution of all ordering relationships. More disturbing still is Plato's insight into how democratic chaos prepares the way for tyranny. When freedom becomes license and equality becomes the destruction of all hierarchy, society becomes ripe for the strong man who promises to restore order through force. The very democracy that prides itself on opposing authoritarianism creates the conditions that make authoritarianism attractive. Our political class speaks constantly of defending democracy while participating in its destruction. They mistake institutional procedures for the spiritual reality that must animate them. Plato understood that constitutional order depends upon the philosophical formation of citizens capable of self-government through reason rather than appetite. The timocratic stage of decay, characterized by the pursuit of honor rather than wisdom, finds perfect expression in our celebrity culture and its extension into politics. Politicians seek fame and recognition rather than truth and justice. Citizens admire success rather than virtue, confusing visibility with significance, popularity with worth. The timocratic soul has replaced love of wisdom with love of victory, creating the competitive dynamic that reduces politics to sport. The oligarchic stage emerges when the pursuit of wealth becomes the dominant social passion. Plato saw that societies organized around economic accumulation inevitably divide into rich and poor, creating the internal conflict that destabilizes constitutional order. Our own society exhibits precisely this dynamic, vast inequality combined with the systematic reduction of all human values to economic categories. But the democratic stage represents the most insidious form of decay because it appears as liberation. Citizens experience the breakdown of traditional authority as freedom rather than recognizing it as the prelude to chaos. Every restraint on appetite is seen as oppression, every call to excellence as elitism, every appeal to transcendent truth as dogmatism. Plato's description of democratic man captures our contemporary condition with uncanny precision. The soul that recognizes no hierarchy among desires, that treats all impulses as equally valid, that mistakes the multiplication of choices for genuine freedom. Such souls create societies that mirror their internal disorder, communities without common purpose, institutions without authority, cultures without standards. The tyrannical stage completes the cycle when democratic chaos becomes unbearable and citizens welcome the strong man who promises to restore order through force. The tyrant emerges not as the enemy of democracy but as its logical conclusion, the final satisfaction of the democratic appetite for immediate gratification freed from all restraint. Understanding this cycle is crucial for diagnosing our current situation. We face not merely political problems that can be solved through better policies or procedures, but the structural decay that Plato identified as inevitable when societies lose contact with transcendent ordering principles. The recovery of constitutional order requires recovering the philosophical understanding that created the possibility of legitimate authority in the first place. Chapter 5: The Noble Lie and Modern Ideology. The concept of the noble lie in Plato's Republic has been consistently misunderstood by modern interpreters who see it as evidence of his authoritarianism. The truth is far more unsettling for our contemporary illusions. Plato recognized that every society requires founding myths that orient citizens toward transcendent truth. The question is not whether such myths will exist, but whether they will be noble, pointing toward reality, or ignoble, concealing it. Take a moment to examine the foundational myths of our own society. We are told that all human beings are naturally equal, that material progress constitutes genuine advance, that individual liberation leads to social harmony, that democratic procedures guarantee just outcomes. These are not empirical observations but articles of faith that shape our perception of reality. The crucial difference lies in the relationship between myth and truth. Plato's noble lie was designed to awaken citizens to the reality of transcendent order by clothing philosophical insights in accessible symbolic form. Modern ideological myths, by contrast, function to prevent recognition of transcendent reality by reducing all human experience to immanent categories. Consider how our educational system indoctrinates students in the myth of historical progress, the belief that humanity is gradually advancing from primitive superstition toward scientific enlightenment. This myth serves to delegitimize traditional wisdom and make contemporary opinions appear as the culmination of human development. The result is precisely the Gnostic consciousness that believes it has transcended all previous understanding. The most pernicious aspect of modern ideological mythology is its claim to scientific status. Unlike traditional societies that acknowledged the mythic character of their founding stories, we insist that our foundational beliefs are simply facts discovered through rational inquiry. This prevents the kind of philosophical examination that might reveal their character as interpretive constructions rather than empirical discoveries. Plato understood that the health of any community depends upon the quality of its myths. When societies embrace myths that deny the reality of transcendent order, they inevitably experience the disorder that follows from spiritual blindness. Our contemporary myths systematically obscure the very realities that make authentic human community possible. The myth of natural equality, for instance, prevents recognition of the hierarchical structure of reality that provides the foundation for justice. When we insist that all differences between human beings are merely conventional, we eliminate the possibility of distinguishing between genuine and counterfeit authority, between legitimate and illegitimate claims to leadership. The myth of material progress conceals the spiritual regression that accompanies technological advance. Citizens become convinced that external improvements necessarily represent human development, preventing them from recognizing the internal decay that threatens civilization from within. The result is societies that grow more sophisticated in their techniques while becoming more primitive in their understanding of human nature. The myth of individual liberation obscures the reality that authentic freedom requires submission to transcendent truth. When liberation is understood as the removal of all external constraints rather than the achievement of internal order, it produces not genuine freedom but sophisticated forms of slavery to unexamined appetites and culturally manufactured desires. Perhaps most destructive is the myth that democratic procedures guarantee just outcomes. This prevents citizens from examining the quality of their own consciousness and character, which ultimately determines whether any political arrangement can serve human flourishing. Democracy becomes a substitute for philosophy rather than a political form that requires philosophical foundation. Plato's noble lie was intended to prepare citizens for the philosophical recognition that would eventually make such myths unnecessary. Our ignoble lies function to prevent the philosophical awakening that would reveal their character as obstacles to truth rather than aids to understanding. The recovery of authentic political order requires honest examination of the mythic foundations of our society. We must distinguish between symbols that point toward transcendent reality and ideologies that conceal it, between founding stories that orient consciousness toward truth and propaganda that systematically obscures it. Only then can we begin the work of creating noble myths that serve human flourishing rather than perpetuating the illusions that ensure our continued entrapment in sophisticated forms of barbarism. Chapter 6: The Forms and the Recovery of Political Wisdom. Plato's theory of forms addresses the fundamental question that underlies all political thinking: is there an objective standard of justice, or are all political arrangements merely conventional? Modern political theory has embraced relativism, treating justice as whatever emerges from democratic procedures or power struggles. This abandonment of the search for transcendent truth explains our contemporary political helplessness. The theory of forms insists that justice, courage, temperance, and wisdom are not merely human constructions but eternal realities that provide the measure for human institutions. Political communities succeed or fail depending upon their participation in these transcendent standards. This insight transforms politics from mere technique into philosophy, the love of wisdom about ultimate reality. Our therapeutic age has systematically obscured this understanding. We speak of values rather than truths, preferences rather than standards, diversity rather than unity around transcendent principles. The result is the fragmentation Plato predicted when he warned that communities without access to eternal truth must collapse into competing factionalisms. But the forms are not abstract philosophical concepts, they are the concrete realities that make human excellence possible. The statesman who genuinely participates in the form of justice can distinguish between authentic and counterfeit claims about political right. The citizen educated in the reality of transcendent order can resist the demagogic appeals that exploit ignorance of true goods. What strikes me as particularly relevant for our situation is Plato's insight that the forms are accessible through philosophical inquiry guided by eros, the love of beauty and truth that draws the soul beyond immediate satisfactions toward eternal realities. This is precisely what our educational system has abandoned in favor of technical training and ideological indoctrination. The recovery of political wisdom requires recovering the philosophical attitude that recognizes transcendent truth as both real and accessible. This is not a retreat from political engagement but the only foundation upon which genuine political order can be built. Without the measure provided by eternal standards, politics becomes mere will to power disguised as rational discourse. Consider how the form of justice operates in concrete political situations. When legislators debate competing proposals, they typically argue from interest, precedent, or popular opinion. The philosopher-statesman would ask instead, which proposal most fully participates in the eternal reality of justice? This is not an abstract question but the most practical inquiry possible, since policies that violate transcendent justice inevitably produce the disorders they claim to solve. The form of courage similarly provides the standard for evaluating political leadership. Authentic courage differs fundamentally from mere boldness or recklessness. It involves the soul's right relationship to danger in service of transcendent goods. Political leaders who lack participation in this eternal reality cannot distinguish between necessary risks and pointless adventures, between principled resistance and stubborn willfulness. The form of temperance offers the measure for assessing the health of political communities. Societies that lose contact with this transcendent standard inevitably experience the multiplication of appetites that Plato identified as the source of political instability. No external arrangements can create order when citizens lack the internal integration that genuine temperance represents. Most crucial is the form of wisdom, which provides the ordering principle for all other virtues. Political communities require leaders who participate in this eternal reality, not mere cleverness or technical expertise, but the wisdom that recognizes the proper hierarchy of goods and the means of achieving them. Without such wisdom, politics degenerates into the manipulation of opinion rather than the pursuit of truth. The modern rejection of Platonic realism has produced the nihilistic politics of our time, the belief that all political arrangements are equally arbitrary, that power rather than truth determines outcomes, That human communities cannot be oriented toward objective goods because no such goods exist. This philosophical error ensures political failure because it eliminates the very standards by which authentic political order could be recognized and achieved. Plato's insight remains revolutionary. Political communities can participate in transcendent realities that make genuine justice, courage, temperance, and wisdom possible. This participation is not automatic but requires the philosophical discipline that recognizes these eternal forms as both real and accessible through properly ordered consciousness. The recovery of this understanding represents our only hope for transcending the political chaos that inevitably follows from the abandonment of transcendent truth. Chapter 7: The Return to the Cave and Our Responsibility. Plato's philosopher, having ascended to the vision of transcendent truth, faces the most difficult choice, whether to remain in contemplative bliss or return to the cave to help fellow prisoners recognize their condition. This dilemma illuminates our own responsibility in an age of spiritual darkness. The temptation for those who have recovered philosophical wisdom is to withdraw from public engagement, leaving society to its chosen delusions. But Plato understood that the philosopher's vision of truth creates an obligation to serve the common good, not through the imposition of abstract theories, but through the patient work of awakening consciousness to realities that can be verified through direct experience. The philosopher returns not as a ruler but as a teacher, helping others discover for themselves the order that makes authentic human community possible. This teaching mission is particularly urgent in democratic societies, where the quality of public discourse determines the health of political institutions. Citizens who mistake opinion for knowledge, who confuse sophistical cleverness with wisdom, who reduce transcendent questions to technical problems, inevitably create the conditions for their own enslavement. The philosopher's political responsibility involves creating what I have called islands of order, communities of inquiry where authentic questions can be pursued without ideological distortion. These may be formal educational institutions, religious communities, or simply circles of friends committed to philosophical honesty about the human condition. What Plato helps us recognize is that this work of consciousness formation is itself the most important political activity. Laws and institutions can preserve order only when they are animated by citizens capable of distinguishing between appearance and reality, between genuine and counterfeit goods, between the authority of truth and the manipulation of power. The return to the cave is not optional for those who have experienced philosophical awakening. The vision of transcendent order creates both the ability and the obligation to resist the disorder of our time through the quiet work of recovering authentic humanity in ourselves and others. Consider the specific challenges facing anyone who attempts this return in our contemporary situation. The cave dwellers of our time are not simply ignorant, they are systematically miseducated. They have been trained to regard the search for transcendent truth as naive, to treat philosophical questions as meaningless, to reduce all human concerns to technical or therapeutic problems. The returning philosopher faces sophisticated forms of resistance unknown in Plato's time. Modern cave dwellers possess elaborate theories that explain why transcendent truth cannot exist, why all claims about reality are merely constructions of power, why traditional wisdom represents nothing more than the prejudices of dead white males. These theories function as intellectual antibodies that prevent the kind of philosophical examination that might lead to genuine awakening. Moreover, the philosopher who attempts to awaken consciousness to transcendent realities must work within institutions, educational, religious, political, that have been systematically corrupted by the very ideologies that prevent philosophical inquiry. The university that should serve philosophical awakening has become an indoctrination center for sophisticated relativism. The churches that should orient consciousness toward divine reality have embraced therapeutic programs for psychological adjustment. The political institutions that should serve justice have become instruments for the satisfaction of organized appetites. Yet Plato's example suggests that even these obstacles cannot prevent the philosophical mission from succeeding. The truth about human nature and its proper ordering cannot be permanently obscured, because it is grounded in the structure of consciousness itself. Every human being retains the capacity for philosophical awakening, regardless of the sophistication of the illusions that temporarily obscure this capacity. The philosopher's return requires infinite patience combined with unwavering commitment to truth. It cannot succeed through direct assault on established opinions but only through the gradual creation of conditions that make genuine inquiry possible. This involves asking questions that awaken wonder, telling stories that point beyond immediate concerns, living in ways that demonstrate the reality of transcendent goods. Most importantly, the philosopher must remember that the goal is not to convert others to particular doctrines but to awaken them to the philosophical attitude itself, the love of wisdom that recognizes transcendent truth as both real and accessible. This awakening cannot be forced but only invited through the patient work of consciousness formation that begins with individual souls and extends gradually to community life. The return to the cave represents both our greatest challenge and our deepest hope. Challenge because it requires sustained engagement with forces that systematically oppose philosophical inquiry. Hope because it demonstrates that authentic political order remains possible through the recovery of wisdom that has been temporarily forgotten but never permanently lost. Conclusion. Plato's political philosophy remains urgently relevant because the problems he diagnosed are permanent features of the human condition rather than accidents of historical circumstance. The tendency toward cave existence, the appeal of sophisticated demagogy, the decay of constitutional order when spiritual foundations erode, these patterns repeat because they reflect the structure of consciousness itself. What Plato offers is not a political program but philosophical medicine for the disorders that perpetually threaten human community. The recovery of authentic politics requires recovering the philosophical attitude that recognizes transcendent truth as both real and necessary for genuine human flourishing. This work cannot be postponed until more favorable circumstances arise, because the circumstances that make it possible must be created through the philosophical labor itself. The cave dwellers will not spontaneously recognize their condition. They require the patient intervention of those who have experienced the ascent toward reality. This remains our task and our hope in an age that has forgotten what Plato knew about the eternal foundations of political order.